She had saved over 200 lives in that hospital. But that morning, they called her into the office, and told her she was the problem. She had saved over 200 lives in that hospital. But that morning, they called her into the office, and told her she was the problem. Her name was Miriam. 38 years old. A senior nurse with 12 years of service at St. Catherine's Medical Center in Chicago. 12 years of night shifts. 12 years of holding the hands of strangers at the worst moments of their lives. 12 years of showing up, always on time, always prepared, always caring. That morning, she walked into the hospital the same way she always did. Head held high, navy blue hijab perfectly in place above her uniform, name badge pinned just below her left shoulder. She greeted the receptionist. She stopped to check on an elderly patient in the hallway. She smiled at a frightened child waiting outside the imaging room. And then her supervisor called her name from across the corridor. Miriam. Mr. Collins wants to see you. Now. She didn't know it yet, but the next 30 minutes would change not only her life, but the life of every Muslim woman working in healthcare across that entire state. The administrator's office smelled like cold coffee and old decisions. Mr. Collins, 57 years old, gray suit, reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose, gestured toward the chair across from his desk without looking up from the paper in front of him. Sit down, Miriam. She sat. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. He cleared his throat. Then he said it. We've received complaints. From patients. And from some of the staff. He paused, as if searching for the right word, or perhaps hoping she would simply agree before he had to finish. They say, your hijab makes them uncomfortable. Silence. Not the silence of a woman with nothing to say. The silence of a woman choosing very carefully which words to use. Uncomfortable, she repeated. Quietly. Steadily. I understand this is sensitive, Collins continued, sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk toward her. But the hospital has a responsibility to all patients. We need our staff to present in a way that feels welcoming. Non-threatening. The paper was a uniform compliance form. At the bottom, a line for her signature. Miriam looked at the form. Then she looked at Mr. Collins. And she asked him a question he had not prepared for. Mr. Collins, she said, her voice perfectly level. How many patients have I treated in this hospital? He blinked. That's not really relevant. Please. Humor me. Do you know the number? He shifted in his chair. Miriam, I don't think. 212, she said. At least, those are the ones I personally documented. That doesn't include emergency assists, night shifts where I covered for understaffed wards, or the 17 patients I sat with through the night because they had no family to call. Collins said nothing. Of those 212 patients, Miriam continued, not one, not a single one, ever filed a complaint about the quality of my care. Not one ever asked for a different nurse because of my work. My performance reviews for 12 years have been rated exceeds expectations. She placed both hands flat on the desk, not aggressively, but with the quiet weight of someone who had prepared for this moment their entire career. So I want to understand something, Mr. Collins. You are asking me to change who I am, to set aside a practice of my faith, not because I failed at my job. But because someone else's discomfort with my identity is more important to this hospital than my 12 years of service. The room was very quiet. Is that what this hospital stands for? What happened next, nobody planned. The glass office wall meant that sound carried, not perfectly, but enough. And Margaret Hayes, 72 years old, recovering from hip surgery in room 14B, had been slowly making her way down the corridor with her walker when she heard Miriam's voice. She stopped. She listened. Margaret was not Muslim. She had never in her life thought particularly deeply about the hijab. She was a retired schoolteacher from Ohio who had moved to Chicago to be near her grandchildren, and she had been a patient at St. Catherine's for 11 days. In those 11 days, Miriam had changed her bedding when no orderly was available, had stayed past the end of a shift to explain her medication to her slowly and clearly, and had once, at 2 in the morning, simply sat beside her when the loneliness became too heavy to bear. Margaret pressed her palm flat against the glass wall of the office. Then she pushed open the door. "Excuse me," she said to Mr. Collins, in the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years managing classrooms of 30 students. "I believe I am one of the patients you're referring to. And I'd like to say something." Mr. Collins opened his mouth. Then closed it again. Margaret Hayes did not wait for his permission. "I have been a patient in this hospital for 11 days, she said, setting her walker firmly beside the chair. She did not sit. She stood. "In those 11 days, this woman has been the single most competent and compassionate person I have encountered in this building. She explained my medications to me 3 times, without ever making me feel like a burden. She checked on me at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep, not because it was in her job description, but because she noticed I was frightened. Her voice was steady. It did not waver. She sat with me and held my hand. And in that moment, I did not see her hijab. I saw a person who cared whether I lived or died." She turned slightly toward Miriam, who was perfectly still. "You want to know who makes me uncomfortable in this hospital, Mr. Collins? It is not her." She gestured toward Miriam. "It is the idea, that you would ask someone with her record, her years, and her heart to become less of herself so that someone else's ignorance feels more comfortable." She picked up her walker. "I want it on record that I support this nurse completely. And if she is asked to leave or to change, I will be calling my son, who is, as it happens, a civil rights attorney in this city." She walked out of the office. The door clicked gently shut behind her. By noon, the story had moved through the hospital the way all important stories do, quietly, carried in low voices between colleagues in break rooms and corridors and elevator rides. Sarah Chen, 26 years old, a second-year nurse who had always admired Miriam from a careful distance, came to find her during the lunch hour. She stood in the doorway of the small staff room, holding 2 cups of coffee, looking uncertain. "I heard what happened," Sarah said. Miriam looked up from the table. She had not eaten. She was looking at her hands. "I want you to know," Sarah continued, "that I told 3 other nurses. And they told others. And there are 7 of us who are willing to write formal statements supporting you." Miriam was quiet for a long moment. "You don't have to do that, Sarah." "No," Sarah agreed. "I don't have to. But I want to." She set one of the coffees down in front of Miriam. "Because what they asked you to do isn't right. And if we don't say something, it never will be." That afternoon, 7 formal letters of support were submitted to the hospital's patient relations department. 2 senior doctors added their names. A ward administrator who had worked alongside Miriam for 9 years wrote a 1-page letter that was described later by the hospital's legal team as the most thorough character reference I have ever read. Something was shifting. Slowly, inexorably, the way glaciers move, or the way great wrongs eventually begin to right themselves. That night, Miriam went home to her apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on the west side of the city. She prayed Isha. She had been praying since she was 7 years old, taught first by her grandmother on a small prayer rug that smelled like rose water and old fabric. The ritual had never once felt like a burden. It had always felt like returning. Like breathing out after holding it in for too long. Tonight, in sujud, her forehead on the cool fabric of the prayer mat, she stayed down longer than usual. She did not ask Allah to make Mr. Collins change his mind. She did not ask for an easy outcome. She had long since understood that ease and rightness were not always the same thing. She asked only for clarity. For steadiness. For the strength not to become bitter. When she rose from her prayer, she felt the thing she always felt after sujud, not certainty, but something better, the absence of panic. The quiet knowledge that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. She called her mother. "I'm okay, Mama," she said before her mother could ask. "I'm okay." There was a pause. "I know you are," her mother said. "I raised you, didn't I?" Margaret's son, as it turned out, was not bluffing. David Hayes, 44 years old, a civil rights attorney with 16 years of experience in employment discrimination law, arrived at St. Catherine's Medical Center the following morning with a briefcase and a calmness that experienced attorneys were like a second uniform. He did not raise his voice. He did not make threats. He sat in Mr. Collins' office, the same office where Miriam had sat 24 hours earlier, and he placed a single document on the desk. "This is a formal complaint filed with the EEOC on behalf of my client," he said. "It outlines a Title VII violation, specifically, religious discrimination in the workplace. You asked a Muslim employee to remove an article of religious clothing as a condition of continued employment. That is textbook discrimination." He paused. "Now, you have two choices. We go through the formal process, which will be uncomfortable for everyone and will certainly attract media attention. Or the hospital takes the weekend to re-examine its uniform policy, issues a formal apology, and implements a clear written religious accommodation framework. My client is not asking for revenge. She is asking for what every employee in this country is entitled to by law." Collins looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked up. "I'll need to speak with our legal team." David Hayes stood, picked up his briefcase, and buttoned his jacket. "Of course," he said. "We have until Monday." Monday came. At 9:15 in the morning, Miriam received an email from the hospital's Director of Human Resources. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she sat very still for a moment. The email informed her that following a comprehensive review of the hospital's uniform and religious accommodation policies, St. Catherine's Medical Center was implementing the following changes, effective immediately. All religious garments, including the hijab, turban, kippah, and cross, were explicitly recognized as protected religious expression and would be accommodated in all departments without exception. A formal religious accommodation request process was being established, including a dedicated HR contact. All management and supervisory staff would be required to complete mandatory religious sensitivity training within 60 days. And, most significantly, the hospital was issuing a formal written apology to Nurse Miriam for the events of the previous week. At the bottom of the email, a name she didn't recognize, Dr. Patricia Owens, hospital director. A woman who had apparently read every one of the support letters. Every one of the performance reviews. And Margaret Hayes' son's legal filing. Miriam put down her phone. She pressed her palms together, raised them slightly toward the ceiling in the gesture her grandmother had taught her, not a formal prayer, just the small language of gratitude between a servant and her Lord. Then she put on her navy hijab, pinned her name badge precisely below her left shoulder, and walked back into the hospital to do her job. In the months that followed, Miriam did not seek interviews. She did not speak to journalists. She returned to her patients, to her shifts, to the small dignified acts of care that had always been the center of her life. But the policy change at St. Catherine's became something larger than one hospital. It was referenced in a regional healthcare conference. It was cited in a guidance document issued by a National Nursing Association. 3 other hospitals in the state quietly reviewed and revised their own accommodation policies in the following year. Margaret Hayes was discharged 2 weeks after the incident. On her last morning, she found Miriam on the ward and handed her a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note, 3 sentences. Miriam kept it in her locker for years. It read, "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for every woman who comes after you. That is what courage looks like." Miriam thought about this often, on the hard shifts, on the nights when exhaustion pressed down like stone, on the mornings when faith felt like the only thing holding the world together. She thought about what her grandmother had always said. That the hijab was not a wall between herself and the world. It was a door, her door, opened on her terms, to whoever was worthy of walking through. She had not asked for a fight. She had not chosen to become a symbol. She had simply refused, quietly, with every fact and every year of service behind her, to let anyone decide that her faith made her less. And in doing so, she had made it possible for others to do the same. Let us all say, Alhamdulillah.